Our course then is plain. The Sioux Indians of Minnesota must be exterminated or forever driven beyond the borders of the state. Governor Alexander Ramsey, September 9, 1862. They desired to possess the whole world. For 30 years, they were trying to entice us to sell them our land. Finally, the outbreak gave them all, and we have been driven away from our beautiful country. A Dakota, remembering the words of his uncle about the war. Taoyateduta led a small band out onto the plains. He still hoped, or said he hoped, to find allies. Perhaps the Yankton, or the Yanktonai, or the Tetons to the west would join him in the war. Perhaps the British to the north and Canada would help him. After all, his ancestors had helped the British fight the Americans in 1812. But Taoyateduta had no success in gaining allies. He had only slightly more success finding food and shelter for his party. By early 1863, word must have reached him about the fate of Dakota warriors who stayed behind. Confident in Sibley's promises not to harm those who had not killed women and children. In makeshift military courts, where dozens of Dakota men were tried in a day, hundreds were sentenced to death for having fought in the war. President Lincoln eventually reduced the number of those under death sentences, but nearly 300 went to prison, and just a day after Christians celebrated the birth of their Savior, Jesus, 38 warriors were hanged at once. It was the largest mass execution in U.S. history. That spring found Taoyateduta at Devil's Lake in what is now North Dakota. From there he planned one last raid into Minnesota. He said he wanted to steal horses so that each of his children would have a pony, a necessary tool when living on the plains and hunting buffalo. Most of their animals had died during the harsh winter. Wowanape and a few others joined Taoyateduta in a raid that June, but the group did not stay together long. The leader was soon alone with his oldest son. The two were picking raspberries one evening as the first stars shone in the sky. They were near Hutchinson, Minnesota. It was July 3rd, 1863. A settler and his son happened upon the two Dakota, and, as any Minnesota settler would likely have done so soon after the war, they opened fire. Taoyateduta grabbed a gun and shot back. One settler shot again, this time hitting his mark. Taoyateduta knew his injuries were fatal. He asked Wowanape for a drink of water. He seemed happy to be going to the land of his fathers. He didn't fight death. Wowanape took his father's medals and medicine bag and put clean moccasins on Taoyateduta's feet. His father would need good moccasins on his journey onto the afterlife. Then Wowanape made his way alone to Devil's Lake. Many have wondered why Taoyateduta made that last trip to Minnesota. Was he hoping to see Sibley, his old friend, and ask for a peaceful surrender? Was he seeking his own death by putting himself in the path of a bullet? Or was he simply trying to provide his children with ponies? Whatever his reason, the world he left behind was as different from the world of his boyhood as any two places could be. Since 1858, the land itself had been known as the state of Minnesota. Most of the inhabitants were bent on making sure that none of the Dakota people lived there. Taoyateduta's people, his Red Nation, were scattering in many directions. Those who surrendered or were later captured found themselves in prison or on desolate reservations far from home. Hundreds died from hunger and disease. Those who survived carried with them stories too horrible to tell. Dakota who fled to the plains joined with other Indian bands. Many eventually found homes on reservations in the Dakotas and Nebraska. Those who traveled north settled on reserves in Canada. The land was new to them. The way of life was hard. Returning to Minnesota seemed impossible. Only death waited for them there. Scattered as they were, relatives lost touch with relatives. On reservations, hunters and warriors became farmers. In fighting their war against the Americans, the Dakota lost nearly everything. But the Dakota did not die. Some who supported the U.S. government stayed on. In the years after the war, small groups returned. By the late 1800s, Dakota communities were reforming back in Minnesota. Americans celebrated Independence Day on the day following Taoyateduta death. Some of the people of Hutchinson brought his body to town and left it on the main street. Boys put firecrackers in his ears and nose. Before long, he had been scalped and his head removed. The rest of his body was thrown in the town dump. By the time the people of Minnesota realized that the dead Indian might be the man they called Little Crow, the horrible devil who'd led the war against them, the body was just a pile of bones. From the strangely shaped lower arms, shattered by gunshots and then healed nearly 20 years before, the body was finally identified. The settler who killed him was given $500 by the state. Taoyateduta's scalp was, for many years, displayed at the State Historical Society. Only in 1971 were his remains finally gathered and put to rest. A grandson asked for the right to bury Taoyateduta near the family home in South Dakota. So for a time, Taoyateduta himself was scattered to the four winds. And for many years, his role in the war with the Americans was greatly misunderstood. Was he a devil who drove his people into a bloody war against women and children? Or was he a man hoping to find some way to survive in a changing world? He had gone to church at the mission on Sunday, the day before the war began, dressed in a suit of Wasichu clothes. He had gone to bed that night hopeful, perhaps, that the annuity would arrive soon, hopeful that his people might not starve that year, that summer. He had gone to bed a tired man, a cast-off leader of a divided people. He awoke into a whirling storm of fear and anger. It was a morning that would forever change his world, yet the changes had begun long before. They had begun when the first boatload of white soldiers arrived to build a fort just up the river from Kaposia, while a young Dakota boy played in the woods.